Kenneth Bailey's hands trembled as he stared into Gary Thompson's eyes, watching something shift and click into place like tumblers in a lock. The confusion that had clouded Gary's features for weeks suddenly cleared, replaced by a recognition so profound it made Kenneth's breath catch in his throat. They stood frozen in the doorway of Kenneth's apartment, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them like a bridge neither had been ready to cross until this moment. Quote Gav Zero, Gary whispered, his voice barely audible above the sound of Kenneth's racing heart. All those times I said I didn't know what I was feeling. All those conversations about not understanding myself. I think I was lying to both of us. Kenneth felt the world tilt on its axis. For months, he had watched Gary struggle with feelings he couldn't name, had listened to him describe a restlessness and confusion that seemed to have no source. Kenneth had offered comfort and friendship, while his own heart broke a little more each day, loving someone who claimed not to understand the very emotions that Kenneth recognized all too clearly. But now, in this suspended moment, Gary was looking at him like he had just solved the most complex puzzle of his life. The realization in his eyes was so naked, so vulnerable, that Kenneth felt his knees nearly buckle under the intensity of it. "What?" Kenneth breathed, his name a prayer and a question all at once. Gary continued, stepping closer, his hand reaching up to cup Kenneth's face with a tenderness that made tears spring to Kenneth's eyes. The kiss that followed was inevitable, a collision of understanding and desire that had been building for months without either of them fully acknowledging it. Kenneth melted into Gary's touch, finally allowing himself to believe that the impossible might actually be happening. But to understand how they arrived at this moment, how two best friends navigated the treacherous waters of self-discovery and hidden love, we need to go back to the beginning. 3 months earlier, Kenneth had been sitting in his favorite coffee shop, grading papers and trying to ignore the familiar ache in his chest that seemed to intensify whenever he thought about Gary. Before we see how this story unfolds completely, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. Kenneth had been harboring feelings for his best friend for over 2 years, watching from the sidelines as Gary dated a string of women who never seemed to make him truly happy. The bell above the coffee shop door chimed, and Kenneth looked up to see Gary walking in, his dark hair disheveled and his usual confident smile replaced by something that looked almost lost. Kenneth's heart did its familiar flutter as Gary spotted him and made his way over, sliding into the chair across from him with a heavy sigh. "Rough day?" Kenneth asked, closing at his laptop to give Gary his full attention. It was something he had learned to do automatically, this complete focus on Gary's needs and emotions, even when it meant setting aside his own work and feelings. Gary ran his hands through his hair, a gesture Kenneth had memorized along with countless others. He said quietly, his eyes focused on the table between them rather than meeting Kenneth's gaze. Kenneth felt a familiar mix of relief and guilt wash over him. Relief because Sarah had been particularly grating, constantly interrupting Gary when he spoke and dismissing his interests with barely concealed contempt. Guilt because Kenneth couldn't help but be happy that another relationship had ended, bringing Gary back to him, even if only as a friend seeking comfort. Kenneth said, and he meant it, even as his heart sang with selfish joy. Gary finally looked up, and Kenneth was struck by the confusion in his eyes. Kenneth leaned forward, his teacher instincts kicking in as he recognized the look of someone grappling with a concept they couldn't quite grasp. "What do you mean by playing a role?" "It's hard to explain," Gary said, his fingers drumming nervously on the table. "When I was with her, doing all the things couples are supposed to do, it felt hollow somehow, like I was going through the motions but not actually feeling anything real. And then I'd come home and talk to you about it, and that felt more genuine than anything I'd experienced with her all week." Kenneth's breath caught in his throat, but he forced himself to remain calm and supportive. This was his role, had always been his role, the best friend who listened and offered advice while quietly dying inside. Kenneth suggested gently. Gary shook his head, frustration evident in the set of his shoulders. Kenneth felt his heart racing as Gary continued, his words echoing thoughts that Kenneth had harbored for months but never dared voice. 16, Gary admitted, his voice so quiet Kenneth had to strain to hear him. 17, The pain in Gary's voice was almost unbearable, and Kenneth found himself reaching across the table to cover Gary's hand with his own. The contact sent electricity shooting up his arm, and he had to fight the urge to pull away, Kenneth said firmly, his thumb unconsciously stroking across Gary's knuckles. Maybe you just haven't found the right person yet. Gary's eyes dropped to their joined hands, and Kenneth watched something flicker across his features. For a moment, Kenneth thought Gary might say something more, might push deeper into the territory they were skirting around. But then Gary pulled his hand away, the moment broken. Gary said, but he didn't sound convinced. I should probably head home. Thanks for listening, Kenneth. I don't know what I'd do without you. Kenneth watched Gary leave, his heart heavy with all the words he couldn't say. He loved Gary with an intensity that sometimes frightened him, but Gary was straight, had always been straight. Kenneth had accepted long ago that his feelings would remain unrequited, that he would have to be content with friendship and the stolen moments of intimacy that came with being Gary's closest confidant. Over the next few weeks, Kenneth noticed a change in Gary. He seemed more introspective, more prone to long silences and thoughtful stares. They still spent time together regularly, but there was an undercurrent of something Kenneth couldn't quite identify. Gary would start conversations about abstract concepts like happiness and fulfillment, only to trail off mid-sentence as if he'd caught himself saying too much. One evening, Kenneth was cooking dinner in his small kitchen when Gary knocked on his door. Kenneth opened it to find his friend looking disheveled and slightly wild-eyed, as if he'd been walking for hours without destination. Gary asked, and Kenneth immediately stepped aside, concern flooding through him. But 23. Gary wandered into Kenneth's living room, his movements restless and agitated. I've been thinking about what you said, about finding the right person, and I keep coming back to the same question. Kenneth followed him, watching as Gary began to pace in front of the couch. What question? Gary stopped abruptly, turning to face Kenneth with an intensity that made Kenneth's pulse quicken. Quote 26. Kenneth felt his mouth go dry. This was dangerous territory, the kind of conversation that could easily lead to confessions he wasn't ready to make. But Gary was looking at him with such earnest confusion that Kenneth couldn't bring himself to deflect. Kenneth said carefully. Gary's eyes never left Kenneth's face as he spoke, and Kenneth felt heat creeping up his neck under the intensity of that gaze. Quote 29. Gary pressed, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Quote 30. Kenneth's heart was hammering so hard he was sure Gary could hear it. I think it feels like electricity, he managed. Like every touch, even the most innocent one, sends sparks through your entire body. Like you're drawn to them in a way that defies logic. Gary was quiet for a long moment, his eyes searching Kenneth's face as if looking for some hidden truth. Then he sat down heavily on Kenneth's couch, his head falling into his hands. I don't think I've ever felt that, Gary said, his voice muffled. Not with any woman I've dated. And that scares me, Kenneth. What if I'm incapable of feeling that kind of connection? Kenneth sat down beside him, leaving careful space between them, even as every instinct screamed at him to close the distance. You're not incapable of anything, he said softly. Maybe you've just been looking in the wrong places. Gary looked up at him, and Kenneth saw something vulnerable and desperate in his expression. What if the problem isn't where I'm looking, but what I'm looking for? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that made Kenneth's breath catch. He wanted to ask what Gary meant, wanted to push for clarification, but he was terrified of the answer, terrified that he was reading too much into Gary's words, projecting his own feelings onto his friend's confusion. Quote 38, Kenneth said, though he was afraid that he did. Gary shifted on the couch, angling his body toward Kenneth. Kenneth felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, one wrong word away from falling into an abyss from which there might be no return. Kutersayam, Kurtan, Gary said, his words coming out in a rush as if he'd been holding them back for too long. And I don't know what that means, but I know it means something. Kenneth's world tilted dangerously. He stared at Gary, searching his face for any sign that this was some kind of misunderstanding. But Gary's expression was open and honest and terrifyingly sincere. Gary, Kenneth began, but Gary held up a hand to stop him. I know this is crazy, Gary continued. I know it doesn't make sense, but I can't stop thinking about it. About you, about us, about what it might mean. Kenneth felt tears pricking at his eyes, a mixture of hope and terror warring in his chest. What exactly are you thinking about? Gary's cheeks flushed, but he didn't look away. I'm thinking about what it would be like to kiss you, he said quietly. And that thought doesn't scare me the way it should. It excites me. The admission hung between them like a live wire crackling with possibility and danger. Kenneth felt like he couldn't breathe, couldn't think beyond the impossible reality of what Gary had just confessed. I need time to figure this out, Gary said, standing abruptly. I need to understand what this means before I do something that might ruin everything between us. Kenneth watched him go, his heart breaking and soaring simultaneously. For the first time in 2 years, there was hope. But hope, Kenneth had learned, could be the cruelest emotion of all. The days that followed were a special kind of torture for Kenneth. Gary had asked for time, and Kenneth was determined to give it to him. But the waiting was agony. Every interaction between them was charged with new meaning, every casual touch or shared glance loaded with the weight of Gary's confession. Kenneth found himself analyzing every moment they'd shared over the past 2 years, looking for signs he might have missed. Had Gary always looked at him a little too long? Had those casual touches always lingered just a beat longer than necessary? Or was Kenneth simply rewriting history to fit his newfound hope? A week after their conversation, Gary showed up at Kenneth's apartment again, but this time he looked more composed, more certain. Kenneth let him in, his heart racing as he tried to read Gary's expression. I've been doing a lot of thinking about, Gary said without preamble, settling onto Kenneth's couch, as if he belonged there. Quote 52. Kenneth sat across from him, maintaining distance even though every cell in his body wanted to close the space between them. Well, chapter 53. Quote, on Gary began, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Quote, as Kenneth nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Quote, Twan, Gary continued, and Kenneth had his eyebrows shot up in surprise. About how societal expectations can make people assume they're straight without ever really examining their feelings. And a lot of what I read resonated with me. Kenneth's heart was pounding so hard, he was sure Gary could hear it. To quote on. Gary paused, his eyes meeting Kenneth's with an intensity that made Kenneth's breath catch. Quote 60. Kenneth felt like the air had been knocked out of his lungs. Quote 60, quote 60, Gary said quickly. Quotes and Kenneth stared at him, overwhelmed by the enormity of what Gary was saying. Quote 60, Gary took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly. Quote 60. Kenneth closed his eyes, feeling tears threaten to spill over. When he opened them again, Gary was watching him with such hope and vulnerability that Kenneth felt his last defenses crumble. Kenneth said quietly, his voice breaking on the words. Quote 67. Gary's face crumpled, and he launched himself across the space between them, pulling Kenneth into his arms. Oh God, Kenneth, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry I put you through that. Kenneth buried his face in Gary's shoulder, breathing in his familiar scent and trying to process the fact that this was actually happening. Quote 69. Quote 70. Gary admitted, his arms tightening around Kenneth. Quote 71. They held each other for a long moment, years of hidden longing and suppressed emotion finally finding release. When they finally pulled apart, Kenneth could see his own wonder and disbelief reflected in Gary's eyes. What happens now? Kenneth asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Gary reached up to cup Kenneth's, his thumb brushing gently across Kenneth's cheekbone. Now we figure it out together. We take it one day at a time and see where this leads us. Are you sure? Kenneth asked, needing the reassurance. This is a big change for you. I don't want you to feel pressured or confused. Gary smiled, and Kenneth saw a peace in his expression that he'd never seen before. Quote 17. Kenneth felt his heart swell with an emotion so intense it was almost painful. Quotes out, he said, the words he'd held back for so long finally free. I love you too, Gary replied. And then he was leaning in, his lips brushing against Kenneth's in a kiss that was soft and tentative and absolutely perfect. The kiss deepened naturally, years of suppressed longing pouring into the connection between them. Kenneth had imagined this moment countless times, but the reality far exceeded anything his imagination had conjured. Gary's lips were warm and soft, and the way he kissed with a mixture of reverence and growing passion made Kenneth feel like he was melting from the inside out. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Gary rested his forehead against Kenneth's, his eyes still closed as if he was savoring the moment. Quote 79. Gary breathed, his voice filled with wonder. Quote Diadin, Kenneth finished, his own voice shaky with emotion. Gary opened his eyes, and Kenneth saw a mixture of joy and amazement in their depths. Quote Doam. Kenneth felt tears pricking at his eyes again. Quote 83, quote Gary said with a smile that was both tender and mischievous. Quote Kenneth laughed, the sound bubbling up from a place of pure happiness. Quote Ashyamam. They spent the rest of the evening talking, sharing feelings and memories they'd kept hidden for too long. Gary told Kenneth about the moments when he'd felt confused by his attraction to his friend, the times when he'd caught himself staring and had to look away. Kenneth shared his own struggles, the careful balance he'd maintained between being supportive and protecting his own heart. Quote 87. Gary said, his fingers intertwined with Kenneth's as they sat close together on the couch. You were helping me move into my new apartment. You'd taken off your shirt because it was so hot, and I couldn't stop looking at you. I told myself it was just admiration, like appreciating a friend's fitness routine. But now I realize it was so much more than that. Kenneth smiled, remembering that day vividly. I caught you looking. I thought I was imagining things, reading too much into it because of my own feelings. You weren't imagining anything, Gary said, lifting their joined hands to press a kiss to Kenneth's knuckles. Quote 91. As the night wore on, they found themselves gravitating closer together, their bodies naturally seeking contact. Kenneth marveled at how right it felt, how perfectly Gary fit against his side, how natural it was to run his fingers through Gary's hair. I should probably go home, Gary said eventually, though he made no move to leave Kenneth's embrace. Quote 90, Kenneth said softly. Quote Winarson. Gary looked up at him, and Kenneth saw a vulnerability in his expression that made his heart ache. Quote when Kenneth cupped Gary's face in his hands, looking directly into his eyes. You're not going to mess anything up. We'll go at whatever pace feels right for you. There's no pressure, no expectations. Just us figuring this out together. Gary's smile was radiant. 77, quoted 98. Kenneth replied, pressing a soft kiss to Gary's lips. I never thought I'd get to have this with you. They decided that Gary would stay, and as they got ready for bed, Kenneth was struck by the domesticity of it all. Gary borrowing a toothbrush, wearing one of Kenneth's t-shirts to sleep in, the easy way they moved around each other in the small bathroom. It felt like something they'd been doing for years rather than for the first time. In bed, they lay facing each other, talking quietly in the darkness. Gary told Kenneth about his fears and uncertainties, his worry about what other people would think, his concern about navigating this new aspect of his identity. I don't know how to be gay, Gary admitted, his voice small in the darkness. Kenneth reached out to stroke his cheek. You don't have to know how to be anything other than yourself. Sexual identity isn't about fitting into a box or following a script. It's about being honest about what you feel and who you love. I love you, Gary said, as if testing the words, seeing how they felt in his mouth. I love you too, Kenneth replied, and they fell asleep holding hands, their fingers intertwined like a promise. The next morning brought a new set of challenges and revelations. Kenneth woke up first, watching Gary sleep in the early morning light filtering through his bedroom curtains. Gary looked peaceful, younger somehow, as if confessing his feelings had lifted a weight he'd been carrying for years. When Gary finally stirred, his eyes opening to meet Kenneth's gaze, his first expression was one of pure joy, as if he'd forgotten for a moment what had transpired and was delighted to remember. Gary said softly, his voice husky with sleep. Quote 105. Kenneth replied, leaning in to press a gentle kiss to Gary's lips. How are you feeling? Gary was quiet for a moment, seeming to take inventory of his emotions. Happy, he said finally. Scared, confused, overwhelmed, but mostly just really, really happy. They made breakfast together, and Kenneth was struck by how natural it felt, how easily they fell into a rhythm of shared tasks and casual affection. Gary would brush past him to reach for something, his hand trailing across Kenneth's back, or Kenneth would press a kiss to Gary's temple, as he passed behind him. It was as if their bodies had been waiting for permission to express what their hearts had known all along. "I need to tell you something," Gary said as they sat down with their coffee and eggs. "I'm supposed to have dinner with my parents tonight. They've been asking about my dating life, wondering why I broke up with Sarah." Kenneth felt a flutter of anxiety in his stomach. "What are you going to tell them?" Gary reached across the table to take Kenneth's hand. Kotasha, Kenneth squeezed his hand. "Quote one artist." "Quote Martin," Gary said, but Kenneth could see the conflict in his eyes. "Quote one," Kenneth's heart swelled at the words, but he also felt the weight of the situation. "We'll figure it out. Whatever you decide, I'll support you." Gary lifted Kenneth's hand to his lips, pressing a soft kiss to his palm. Quote one saying, the question was rhetorical, but Kenneth answered anyway. Quote 118. Gary's eyes misted over. "I spent so many years feeling like I was living someone else's life. Like I was an actor playing a role that never quite fit. But with you, I feel like myself, like the person I was always meant to be." Kenneth felt his own eyes welling up. "I know exactly what you mean. I've felt like a ghost in my own life for so long, watching you from the sidelines, loving you from a distance. But this, us, it makes me feel real again." They spent the day together, taking a walk through the park, holding hands and talking about everything and nothing. Kenneth noticed the way Gary's eyes lit up when he laughed, the way he unconsciously leaned into Kenneth's touch, the way he looked at Kenneth like he was something precious and miraculous. As evening approached and Gary prepared to leave for dinner with his parents, the anxiety in the air was palpable. Kenneth could see the internal struggle playing out on Gary's face, the war between his newfound happiness and his fear of judgment. Kenneth said, pulling Gary into his arms at the door. Gary buried his face in Kenneth's neck, breathing deeply. "I'm so afraid of losing you. What if this is all too much? Too fast? What if I can't handle the pressure?" Kenneth pulled back to look into Gary's eyes, his hands framing Gary's face. "You're not going to lose me. I've waited 2 years for this chance, and I'm not going anywhere. We'll take this one day at a time, one challenge at a time, together." Gary's kiss was desperate and clinging, as if he was trying to memorize the feeling in case it was the last time. Kenneth poured all of his love and reassurance into the kiss, trying to convey without words that he would be there no matter what. Quote Twy, Gary promised, as he reluctantly pulled away. Quote Once to, Kenneth replied, and he meant it in every possible sense. Kenneth spent the evening in a state of restless anxiety, unable to focus on anything for more than a few minutes at a time. He tried grading papers, watching television, reading a book, but his mind kept drifting to Gary and how his dinner with his parents was going. He found himself checking his phone constantly, hoping for a text or call that would give him some indication of how things were proceeding. When his phone finally rang at nearly 10 o'clock, Kenneth nearly dropped it in his haste to answer. "How did it go?" he asked without preamble. Gary's sigh was audible through the phone. Kenneth's heart ached for the conflict he could hear in Gary's voice. Kenneth could picture Gary running his hands through his hair, a gesture he made when he was stressed or frustrated. "But for one," quote, Gary said, but his voice was heavy. Quote, Kenneth felt a warmth spread through his chest despite the difficult circumstances. Quote 134 on, quote 135 months, Gary asked suddenly. Quote 136 or quote 137. Kenneth said immediately, quote 138. 20 minutes later, Gary was at Kenneth's door, looking emotionally drained but relieved to be there. Kenneth pulled him into his arms immediately, feeling the tension in Gary's body begin to ease as they held each other. Gary said into Kenneth's shoulder, "I know it was only a few hours, but I missed you." Kenneth's heart clenched with love and tenderness. But part one. They settled on the couch, Gary's head in Kenneth's lap as Kenneth ran his fingers through Gary's hair. It was a position they'd been in countless times before, but now it carried new meaning, new intimacy. Kenneth said gently. Gary closed his eyes, seeming to gather his thoughts. Quote 24. Kenneth continued his gentle stroking, waiting for Gary to continue. Quote 45. Kenneth's breath caught at the phrase "love of my life," the casual way Gary said it, making it somehow more powerful than any dramatic declaration. "My dad asked if I was dating anyone, and I said not exactly, but that there was someone special in my life. someone who understood me better than anyone ever had. I could see them both perk up, thinking I was about to introduce them to some wonderful woman. Gary opened his eyes, looking up at Kenneth with a mixture of love and regret. I wanted so badly to tell them about you, to see their faces light up when I talked about how amazing you are, how much you mean to me. Instead, I had to be vague and evasive, and it felt awful. Kenneth leaned down to press a kiss to Gary's forehead. Quote 148 and quote 149. Gary agreed. Quote 150. Kenneth continued stroking Gary's hair, thinking about his own coming out experience years earlier. When I came out to my parents, I was terrified. I'd built up this whole scenario in my head about how they might react, all the worst case possibilities. But you know what actually happened? Gary shook his head, his attention focused entirely on Kenneth. My mom cried, but not for the reasons I expected. She cried because she realized how much I'd been struggling alone, how much pain I'd been carrying. She said she wished I'd felt safe enough to tell her sooner, that she hated the idea of me suffering in silence. Kenneth paused, remembering that conversation with crystal clarity. My dad was quiet for a long time, and I thought that was it, that I'd lost him. But then he asked me if I was happy, if I felt like I could be myself. When I said yes, he said that was all that mattered to him. Gary reached up to touch Kenneth's face, his thumb brushing across Kenneth's cheekbone. How long did it take you to work up the courage to tell them? About 6 months after I fully accepted it myself, Kenneth admitted. And even then, it was terrifying. But it was also one of the most liberating experiences of my life. Not having to hide anymore, not having to watch every word or edit myself. It was like finally being able to breathe freely. Gary was quiet for a long moment, processing Kenneth's words. Quote 157 in, he said finally. Quote 158. Kenneth felt his heart swell with love and pride. Quote 159. Gary sat up, turning to face Kenneth fully. Quote 160. Kenneth felt a flutter of anxiety. Quote 160. Quote God. Kenneth's eyebrows shot up in surprise. She said that? Gary nodded, a rueful smile playing at his lips. According to my mom, Sarah said that I never seemed fully present in our relationship, that it felt like I was holding back emotionally. She said she'd started to wonder if maybe I was struggling with my sexuality. Kenneth wasn't sure how to respond to that revelation. Quote 165. Quote 1. Kenneth reached for Gary's hands, intertwining their fingers. How do you feel about that? Gary considered the question carefully. Scared, but also kind of relieved? Like maybe when I am ready to tell them, it won't come as a complete shock. Maybe they'll have had time to adjust to the possibility. Kenneth squeezed his hands. That could actually be a good thing. It might make the conversation easier when you're ready to have it. Gary leaned forward, resting his forehead against Kenneth's. Quote 170. Kenneth kissed him softly, pouring all of his love and support into the gentle contact. Quote 100, quote 10, Gary said, quote 1, they made love for the first time that night, a slow, tender exploration that was equal parts passion and revelation. Gary approached each touch, each kiss, with a sense of wonder, as if he was discovering not just Kenneth's body, but his own capacity for desire. Kenneth was patient and gentle, letting Gary set the pace, marveling at the way Gary responded to his touch, with an enthusiasm and genuine pleasure that he'd never shown with any of his female partners. Afterward, they lay tangled together in Kenneth's bed, Gary's head on Kenneth's chest, both of them still catching their breath. That was, Gary began, then trailed off, seeming unable to find adequate words. Different? Kenneth supplied gently. Gary lifted his head to look at Kenneth, his eyes bright with emotion. It was everything I never knew I was missing. All those years of feeling like something was wrong with me, like I was broken somehow. But I wasn't broken. I was just looking in the wrong direction. Kenneth stroked Gary's back, feeling overwhelmed with tenderness. Kotatsunim. Gary was quiet for a moment, seeming to take inventory of his emotions. Quote Astalone, he said finally. Quote one, and Kenneth felt tears prick at his eyes. Quote Waddy. Gary crawled up to kiss him, the contact soft and sweet. Quote one, and they talked until the early hours of the morning, sharing their fears and hopes for the future. Gary spoke about his concerns regarding his career, wondering if being openly gay would affect his prospects in his conservative field. Kenneth shared his own experiences with workplace discrimination and the ways he'd learned to navigate professional relationships as an openly gay man. The thing is, Gary said as dawn began to creep through the windows, I don't want to live in fear anymore. I don't want to spend my life hiding who I am or pretending to be someone I'm not. I want to be proud of who I love. Kenneth felt his heart swell with pride and love. I'm so proud of you. The courage it takes to completely re-examine your life, to be willing to change everything you thought you knew about yourself. That's incredible. Gary smiled, but Kenneth could see the exhaustion in his eyes. I couldn't have done it without you. You make me brave. They finally fell asleep as the sun was rising, wrapped around each other in Kenneth's bed. Kenneth woke a few hours later to find Gary watching him with a soft smile, his hair mussed and his eyes bright with happiness. Gary said, pressing a kiss to Kenneth's lips. Kenneth's heart fluttered at the endearment, at the easy affection in Gary's voice. Good morning, how long have you been awake? A while, Gary admitted. I was just watching you sleep, thinking about how lucky I am. Kenneth pulled him closer, marveling at how right it felt to wake up in Gary's arms. Quote one sided. Gary's expression grew slightly more serious. I want to tell my sister. She's always been my closest family member, and I think she'll be supportive. Plus, I could use some advice on how to handle things with my parents. Kenneth nodded, understanding the need for family support during such a major life change. That sounds like a good idea. Do you want me to come with you? Gary's face lit up. Quote 193. Kenneth felt a thrill at being called Gary's boyfriend, the label still new and wonderful. I'd love to meet her, and it's not awkward at all. She's going to love you. They spent the morning getting ready, and Kenneth noticed how Gary seemed both nervous and excited about the prospect of introducing him to his sister. Gary kept checking his appearance in the mirror, adjusting his hair, and asking Kenneth if he looked okay. You look perfect, Kenneth assured him, straightening Gary's collar with tender hands. Code 196. Gary caught Kenneth's hands, bringing them to his lips to press soft kisses to his palms. I love how you always know exactly what to say to make me feel better. I love you, Kenneth replied simply, and the words felt as natural as breathing. Gary's sister Hannah lived across town in a small apartment filled with plants and artwork. She opened the door with a bright smile that faltered slightly when she saw Kenneth standing beside her brother. Quote, one day, she said, her eyes curious as they moved between the two men. Quote, ton, Gary said, his voice slightly nervous, but proud. Quote, ton, Kenneth extended his hand with a warm smile. Quote, ton, Hannah shook his hand, her expression friendly but puzzled. Quote, torn, Gary said, and Kenneth could hear the weight of meaning in his voice. Hannah invited them in, offering coffee and settling them in her cozy living room. Kenneth could see her studying them, noting the way Gary sat close to him on the couch, the way their hands kept finding each other. Quote 205. Hannah said finally, settling into her chair with her coffee cup. Quote 206. Gary took a deep breath, reaching for Kenneth's hand. I have something important to tell you. Something that's going to change how you see me, maybe how you see everything about my life up to this point. Hannah's expression grew more serious, her attention focused entirely on her brother. Quote 100. Gary squeezed Kenneth's hand, drawing strength from the contact. I'm gay, Hannah. I'm in love with Kenneth, and he's in love with me, and we're together. The silence that followed Gary's announcement seemed to stretch on forever, though it was probably only a few seconds. Hannah's eyes widened, moving between her brother and Kenneth with a mixture of surprise and dawning understanding. Oh my God, she said finally, her voice soft with emotion. Gary, wow, that explains so much. Gary's grip on Kenneth's hand tightened. What do you mean? Hannah leaned forward, her expression earnest. You've never been truly happy with any woman you've dated. I always wondered why, because they were all lovely people, but you never seemed fully invested. And lately you've been different, lighter somehow. I thought maybe you'd met someone new, but you kept deflecting when I asked. Gary's shoulders relaxed slightly. Kotter to Forstorin. Hannah's eyes filled with tears, and she got up to cross the room and pull Gary into a tight hug. The only thing I'm disappointed about is that you felt like you had to hide this from me. I love you, Gary. Nothing about that is ever going to change. Kenneth felt his own eyes misting over as he watched the siblings embrace. When Hannah pulled back, she turned to him with a warm smile. And Kenneth, I can see why Gary fell for you. He's been talking about you for years, though I don't think he realized what he was really saying. Kenneth felt heat creep up his neck. He's been talking about me? Hannah laughed, settling back into her chair. Constantly. Kenneth thinks this. Kenneth said that. Kenneth helped me with this project. I used to tease him about having a man crush, but now I realize it was so much more than that. Gary groaned, covering his face with his hands. Was I that obvious? Only to someone who knows you really well, Hannah assured him. But looking back, yeah, it was pretty clear that Kenneth was the most important person in your life. Kenneth felt a warmth spread through his chest at the revelation that Gary had been talking about him for years, that his importance in Gary's life had been apparent to those who knew him best. Hannah asked, looking between them. Gary said, quote 224. Hannah nodded, her expression thoughtful. Quote 2. Kenneth laughed, feeling some of the tension in the room ease. Quote toss, quote, Hannah said with sympathy for, no, quote 2. Gary turned to look at Kenneth with such adoration that Kenneth felt his breath catch. Quote twinning, Hannah wiped at her eyes, smiling through her tears. Quote toward. They spent the next few hours talking, with Hannah asking thoughtful questions about Gary's journey of self-discovery and Kenneth's experience being gay. She was curious but respectful, clearly wanting to understand and support her brother in any way she could. Quote 231. Hannah asked eventually the question that had been hanging in the air. Gary's expression grew more serious. I'm not ready to tell them yet. Last night at dinner, they could tell something was different, but I couldn't bring myself to say anything. Hannah nodded understandingly. They're going to need time to adjust. You know how they are about change, but they love you. Gary, once they see how happy you are, they'll come around. Do you really think so? Gary asked, vulnerability clear in his voice. Hannah reached over to squeeze his hand. I know so. They might be shocked at first. They might need time to process, but they're not going to stop loving you. You're their son. Kenneth watched the exchange with a mixture of relief and anxiety. He was so grateful that Gary had Hannah's support, but he also knew that the conversation with their parents would be much more challenging. Quote 236, Gary said, glancing at Kenneth. Quote 237. Hannah's eyebrows shot up. Really? What did Mom say? She was defensive at first, but then she got quiet. I think she might be considering the possibility. Hannah was quiet for a moment, processing this information. That might actually make things easier when you're ready to tell them. They'll have had time to think about it. That's what Kenneth said, Gary replied, smiling at him with such warmth that Kenneth felt his heart skip. Kenneth sounds like a very wise man, Hannah said with a grin. I can see why you fell for him. As the afternoon wore on, Kenneth found himself genuinely enjoying Hannah's company. She was warm and funny, with the same kind eyes as Gary, and a fierce loyalty to her brother that Kenneth found endearing. She told stories about Gary's childhood, sharing embarrassing moments and sweet memories that painted a picture of a sensitive, thoughtful boy who had always been a little different from his peers. He was always the one taking care of everyone else, Hannah said, watching Gary with fond eyes. In high school, he was the friend all the girls went to for advice about boys. I used to think it was because he was safe, non-threatening. Now I realize it was because he genuinely understood them better than most guys do. Gary groaned again. Please stop psychoanalyzing my entire life. Hannah laughed. I'm just saying, the signs were there if we'd known how to read them. When it was time to leave, Hannah hugged them both tightly, making Kenneth promise to take care of her brother and making Gary promise to bring Kenneth around more often. I'm so happy for you both, she said, tears in her eyes again. This is how love is supposed to look. You can see it in the way you look at each other. As they walked back to Kenneth's car, Gary was quiet, processing the afternoon's events. How are you feeling? Kenneth asked, taking Gary's hand as they reached the car. Gary stopped, turning to face Kenneth with a smile that was radiant with happiness and relief. Quote 251. Kenneth cupped Gary's face in his hands, looking into his eyes with all the love he felt. It's going to be more than okay. It's going to be beautiful. Gary's kiss was soft and grateful, full of promise for the future they were building together. The weeks that followed were a period of adjustment and discovery for both of them. Gary threw himself into learning about LGBTQ plus history and culture with the same intensity he brought to everything else in his life. He read books, watched documentaries, and asked Kenneth countless questions about his own experiences coming out and living as a gay man. Kenneth found Gary's enthusiasm both endearing and occasionally overwhelming. There were moments when Gary seemed to be trying to make up for lost time, as if he could somehow compensate for the years he'd spent not understanding himself by immersing himself completely in his new identity. Quote 253. Kenneth told him one evening as Gary pored over yet another book about gay rights history. Quote 254. Gary looked up from his book, his expression thoughtful. Quote 255. Kenneth moved to sit beside him on the couch, gently closing the book and taking Gary's hands in his. You're the same person you've always been. Your sexuality doesn't change your fundamental character, your values, your interests. It just explains some things that didn't make sense before. Gary leaned into Kenneth's touch, his expression softening. Quote 257. Kenneth's heart ached for the pain in Gary's voice. Quote 258. Gary was quiet for a moment, processing Kenneth's words. Did you go through that when you came out? I did, Kenneth admitted. I spent months feeling angry at myself for not figuring it out sooner, for all the time I'd wasted trying to be someone I wasn't. But eventually I realized that every experience I'd had, even the difficult ones, had led me to who I am now. And I like who I am. Gary smiled, the first genuine smile Kenneth had seen from him all evening. I like who you are too, and I'm starting to like who I am when I'm with you. Kenneth kissed him softly, pouring all of his love and support into the contact. You're going to be okay. We're going to be okay. Gary's response was interrupted by his phone ringing. He glanced at the screen, and his expression grew tense. Quote 264, he said, looking at Kenneth with uncertainty. Quote 265, Kenneth asked. Gary hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Quote 266, Kenneth squeezed his hand encouragingly as Gary answered the phone. Quote 267, Gary said, his voice carefully neutral. Kenneth could hear the muffled sound of his mother's voice through the phone, though he couldn't make out the words. He watched Gary's expression grow more tense as the conversation continued. I'm fine, Mom. Just busy with work, Gary said, but Kenneth could see the strain in his posture. There was a longer pause as his mother spoke, and Gary's eyes met Kenneth's with a look of panic. No, I'm not avoiding you, Gary said, though they both knew that wasn't entirely true. Quote 270. Kenneth rubbed Gary's back soothingly, offering what comfort he could as Gary navigated the difficult conversation. What kind of things? Gary repeated his mother's question, his voice strained. Quote 272. Kenneth could see Gary struggling with how much to reveal, the war between his desire to be honest and his fear of his parents' reaction playing out on his face. Mom, can I call you back later? I'm in the middle of something right now, Gary said finally, and Kenneth could hear the relief in his voice as he found an escape route. Gary hung up the phone and immediately buried his face in his hands. She knows something's up, he said, his voice muffled. She said I sound different, that she's worried about me, and the worst part is that she's not wrong to worry. Everything about my life is different now. Kenneth pulled Gary into his arms, holding him close. Different doesn't mean bad. You're happier now than you've ever been. I know, Gary said, lifting his head to look at Kenneth. But try explaining that to parents who don't know why their son suddenly seems like a completely different person. Kenneth stroked Gary's hair, thinking about his own experience with his parents. Quote 179. Gary was quiet for a long moment, considering Kenneth's words. I'm terrified they'll reject me. What if they can't accept this part of me? What if I lose them? Kenneth cupped Gary's face in his hands, looking directly into his eyes. Gary leaned into Kenneth's touch, drawing strength from the contact. Will you be there with me when I tell them? Kenneth felt his heart swell with love and pride. If that's what you want, absolutely. I'll be there for whatever you need. Gary's smile was tremulous but genuine. Kenneth replied, pressing a soft kiss to Gary's lips. We're in this together now. 3 days later, Gary called his parents and asked if he could come over for dinner, mentioning that he wanted to bring someone special to meet them. Kenneth could see the anxiety radiating from Gary as he made the call, but there was also a determination that hadn't been there before. Gary told Kenneth after he hung up, quote 208, Kenneth felt both honored and terrified by the prospect of meeting Gary's parents under these circumstances. He knew how much they meant to Gary, and he desperately wanted their approval, not just for his own sake, but for Gary's peace of mind. They spent the morning preparing, with Gary changing his outfit 3 times and Kenneth trying to calm his own nerves about making a good first impression. Quote 289. Kenneth asked as they drove to Gary's childhood home. Gary reached over to squeeze his hand. They're not going to hate you. You're kind, intelligent, successful, and you make their son happy. What's to hate? The fact that I'm a man, Kenneth pointed out. Gary was quiet for a moment, acknowledging the validity of Kenneth's concern. Quote 292. Kenneth felt a surge of love for Gary's fierce protectiveness, even as he hoped it wouldn't come to that. Gary's childhood home was a modest 2-story house in a quiet suburban neighborhood, with a well-maintained garden and a front porch decorated with hanging plants. Kenneth could picture Gary growing up here, playing in the backyard and doing homework at the kitchen table. Gary's parents, Gregory and Helen, met them at the door with warm smiles that faltered slightly when they saw Kenneth standing beside their son. Kenneth could see them trying to process the situation, their expressions shifting from confusion to curiosity. Gary said, his voice steady despite the tension Kenneth could feel radiating from him. Quote 2294. Kenneth stepped forward with his most genuine smile, extending his hand to Gary's father. It's such a pleasure to meet you both. Gary talks about you all the time. Gregory shook his hand with a firm grip, his expression polite but puzzled. Nice to meet you, Kenneth. Are you a colleague of Gary's? Actually, Gary interjected, his voice gaining strength. Kenneth is my boyfriend. We're together. The silence that followed was deafening. Kenneth watched as Gary's parents processed this information, their faces cycling through surprise, confusion, and something that might have been understanding. Helen was the first to recover, her expression softening as she looked between her son and Kenneth. Quote 299, quote, she said quietly, and Kenneth could see her mind working, pieces clicking into place. Gregory cleared his throat, his expression more carefully neutral. He said finally, the meal that followed was awkward but not hostile. Gary's parents asked Kenneth polite questions about his work and his background, clearly trying to process this unexpected development while maintaining their manners. Kenneth could see them studying Gary, noting the way he looked at Kenneth, the easy affection between them. So, Helen said finally, as they were clearing the dinner dishes, how long have you two been together? Gary glanced at Kenneth before answering. Officially, about a month, but we've been best friends for over 2 years. Helen nodded slowly and Kenneth could see understanding dawning in her eyes. That explains a lot, actually. You've been so much happier lately, more like yourself than you've been in years. Gregory was quieter, his expression thoughtful as he processed this information. Finally, he looked directly at Gary. Are you happy, son? He asked simply. Gary's eyes filled with tears at the question. Quote 307. Gregory nodded once, then turned to Kenneth. Quote 308. Kenneth felt his throat tighten with emotion. Quote 309. Gregory studied Kenneth's face for a long moment, then nodded again. That's what matters then. Helen wiped at her eyes, moving to pull Gary into a tight hug. I'm sorry if we seemed shocked, sweetheart. It's just that this is new for us, but if you're happy, if this is who you are, then we'll learn to understand it. Gary broke down completely then, sobbing into his mother's shoulder with relief and gratitude. Kenneth felt his own eyes fill with tears as he watched the family embrace. Gary said through his tears. Helen said firmly, pulling back to look at her son. Quote 315, Gregory moved to join the embrace, and after a moment's hesitation, he gestured for Kenneth to join them as well. Welcome to the family, Kenneth, Gregory said quietly, and Kenneth felt his heart overflow with gratitude and love. The months that followed were a period of adjustment and growth for everyone involved. Gary's parents made a genuine effort to understand and accept their son's sexuality, asking questions and educating themselves about LGBTQ+ issues. They attended a PFLAG meeting and read books about supporting gay children, approaching Gary's coming out with the same methodical care they brought to everything else in their lives. Kenneth was gradually integrated into family gatherings and traditions, and he found himself developing genuine affection for Gary's parents. Helen would call him directly sometimes, asking for advice about what to cook for Gary or sharing funny stories about her son's childhood. Gregory was more reserved but consistently kind, including Kenneth in conversations about sports and politics, as if he'd always been part of the family. "I think my dad likes you more than he likes me," Gary joked one evening after a family dinner where Gregory and Kenneth had spent an hour debating the merits of various baseball teams. Kenneth laughed, pulling Gary closer on the couch. "He's just happy that you're happy. They both are." Gary smiled, but Kenneth could see something thoughtful in his expression. "I keep thinking about all the time I wasted, all the years I spent trying to be someone I wasn't. Sometimes I wonder what my life would have been like if I'd figured this out sooner." Kenneth turned to face Gary fully, his expression serious. "Do you regret the time it took you to get here?" Gary considered the question carefully. "I regret the pain I caused myself and the pain I probably caused some of the women I dated. But I don't regret the journey because it led me to you. And I don't think I would have been ready for this, for us, if I'd figured it out earlier. I needed to go through all of that confusion and searching to really understand what I wanted." Kenneth felt his heart swell with love for Gary's wisdom and self-awareness. Quote, 322. Gary leaned in to kiss him, the contact soft and grateful. Quote 323. Kenneth deepened the kiss, marveling as he always did at how perfectly they fit together, how natural this felt despite its unexpected beginning. When they broke apart, Gary rested his forehead against Kenneth's, his eyes bright with emotion. "I have something I want to ask you," Gary said, his voice soft but serious. Kenneth felt his heart skip a beat at Gary's tone. Gary reached into his pocket, pulling out a small velvet box that made Kenneth's breath catch in his throat. "I know we've only been together for a few months," Gary said, his hands trembling slightly as he opened the box to reveal a simple but elegant ring. "But I've loved you for longer than that, even when I didn't understand what that love meant. And I know with absolute certainty that I want to spend the rest of my life with you." Kenneth stared at the ring, then at Gary's face, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was happening. Quote 328. Gary continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. Quote 329. Kenneth felt tears streaming down his face as he looked at the man he loved, the man who had been brave enough to completely reimagine his life in order to be true to himself. Kenneth whispered, his voice breaking with emotion. Quote 331. Gary's hands shook as he slipped the ring onto Kenneth's finger, and then they were kissing and crying and laughing all at once, overwhelmed by the joy of this moment and the promise of their future together. Quote 332. Gary said against Kenneth's lips, "I love you so much it scares me sometimes." "Don't be scared," Kenneth replied, echoing the words Gary had said to him months earlier. "I'm not going anywhere. This is where I belong." They held each other on Kenneth's couch, the same couch where they'd had so many difficult conversations about feelings and identity and fear. Now it was the place where they'd gotten engaged, where they'd promised to build a life together. "My parents are going to be so excited," Gary said, pulling back to look at Kenneth with shining eyes. "They've been dropping hints about grandchildren and family traditions. I think they're ready for us to make this official." Kenneth laughed, thinking about Helen's not-so-subtle questions about their future plans. "At the first, Gary agreed. "What the forum?" Kenneth looked down at the ring on his finger, still hardly believing this was real. Quote 341. Gary was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. Quote 342. Kenneth felt his heart overflow with love, and gratitude. Quote 343. Gary's smile was radiant. "We're going to have such a beautiful life together." Kenneth kissed him again, tasting the salt of happy tears and the sweetness of promises kept. Outside, the world continued its usual rhythm, but inside Kenneth's apartment, time seemed suspended in this perfect moment of love and commitment and hope for the future. They were married 6 months later in a small ceremony in Kenneth's parents' backyard, surrounded by family and close friends. Gary's parents had thrown themselves into wedding planning with the same enthusiasm they'd once reserved for his heterosexual relationships, and Kenneth's parents had welcomed Gary into their family with open arms. Hannah served as Gary's best person, while Kenneth's sister Joyce stood beside him. The ceremony was officiated by Kenneth's former professor, a kind man who had been openly gay for decades and had served as an informal mentor during Kenneth's own coming out process. As Kenneth watched Gary walking down the aisle toward him, resplendent in a perfectly tailored suit and beaming with joy, he thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. All those months of hidden longing, of careful friendship while his heart broke a little more each day. All of Gary's confusion and searching, his brave decision to question everything he thought he knew about himself. Gary's eyes never left Kenneth's face as he approached, and Kenneth could see his own wonder and gratitude reflected there. When Gary reached him, he took Kenneth's hands and squeezed them gently. "Hi," Gary whispered, just for Kenneth's ears. Kenneth whispered back, his heart so full he thought it might burst. The ceremony itself was simple and heartfelt, focused on the promises they were making to each other rather than elaborate traditions. When it came time for their vows, Gary spoke first, his voice clear and strong, despite the tears in his eyes. He began. Kenneth felt tears streaming down his face as Gary continued. Quote 349. Kenneth's own vows were simpler, but no less heartfelt. "Gary," he said, his voice shaking with emotion, "loving you taught me that the most beautiful things in life often come disguised as something else entirely. What I thought was hopeless longing was actually the foundation of the deepest love I've ever known. You've shown me that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to be vulnerable in spite of it. You changed your entire understanding of yourself because you were brave enough to follow your heart, and I'm honored to be the person your heart led you to." When they kissed as newly married husbands, Kenneth felt like his heart might explode with happiness. The applause from their gathered loved ones seemed to come from very far away, muffled by the rushing of blood in his ears and the overwhelming realization that this was real, that they had actually made it to this moment. The reception was held in the same backyard, with string lights hung between the trees and tables decorated with simple white flowers. Kenneth's mother had outdone herself with the catering, and Gary's father had surprised everyone by giving a toast that was both heartfelt and humorous. "When Gary first brought Kenneth home," Gregory said, raising his glass, "I'll admit I was surprised. But watching them together, seeing how they look at each other, how they support and challenge and love each other, I realized that this is what we all hope for our children. Not that they'll follow a prescribed path, but that they'll find someone who makes them the best version of themselves." Helen wiped at her eyes as Gregory continued. "Kenneth, thank you for loving our son so completely. And Gary, thank you for being brave enough to follow your heart, even when it led you somewhere unexpected. Here's to a lifetime of love, laughter, and the courage to keep choosing each other every day." The toast was met with enthusiastic applause, and Kenneth felt overwhelmed by the love and acceptance surrounding them. As the evening wore on, he found himself stealing quiet moments with Gary, marveling at the fact that they were married, that this incredible man was his husband. "How does it feel?" Gary asked during a brief lull in the festivities, pulling Kenneth aside for a private moment. Kenneth looked around at their friends and family, all celebrating their love, then back at Gary's face, radiant with happiness in the soft light of the string lights. Kenneth said, echoing the words he'd spoken months earlier when Gary had asked him what love felt like. "Like everything in my life led to this moment." Gary's kiss was soft and sweet, tasting of champagne and promises and the beginning of their new life together. Quote 358. Gary whispered against Kenneth's lips. Kenneth felt his heart soar at the word. "I love you too, husband." They danced their first dance to a song they'd chosen together, a gentle ballad about finding love in unexpected places. As they swayed together in their backyard reception, Kenneth thought about all the moments that had led them here. The coffee shop conversations, the late-night talks on his couch, the first tentative kiss, the difficult conversations with family, the gradual building of a life together. Gary asked, noticing Kenneth's contemplative expression. "Just how perfect this is," Kenneth replied. "How perfectly imperfect our story is. All the confusion and fear and uncertainty that led us here." Gary smiled, spinning Kenneth gently as the song continued. "I wouldn't change any of it. Every difficult moment, every confused conversation, every tear we shed trying to figure this out, it all brought us here." Kenneth felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over him as he looked into his husband's eyes. Quote 364. Quote on Gary replied, and Kenneth knew he was absolutely right. 5 years later, Kenneth woke up in their shared bed in the house they'd bought together, sunlight streaming through the windows and the sound of Gary making coffee drifting up from the kitchen. It was a Saturday morning, lazy and peaceful, and Kenneth allowed himself a few moments to simply lie in bed and appreciate the life they'd built together. Their bedroom walls were decorated with photos from their travels together, their wedding day, family gatherings, and quiet moments at home. Kenneth's favorite was a candid shot Hannah had taken of them at their first Christmas as a married couple, both of them laughing at something Gary's father had said, their faces bright with joy and contentment. Kenneth made his way downstairs to find Gary at the stove, making pancakes while humming softly to himself. He was wearing Kenneth's old college t-shirt and a pair of sleep shorts, his hair still mussed from sleep, and Kenneth felt the same flutter of attraction he'd experienced the first time Gary had kissed him. Kenneth said, wrapping his arms around Gary from behind and pressing a kiss to his neck. Gary leaned back into the embrace, sighing contentedly. Quote 367. Kenneth looked over Gary's shoulder at the perfectly golden pancakes and felt his heart swell with love for this man who still made an effort to surprise and delight him after all these years. What's the occasion? Kenneth asked, though he didn't really need one to appreciate Gary's thoughtfulness. Gary turned in Kenneth's arms, his expression soft and happy. Quote 369. Kenneth kissed him softly, tasting the lingering flavor of the coffee Gary had been drinking. Quote 370. Quote 371. Gary replied, and the words carried the weight of years of shared experiences, challenges overcome together, and a love that had only deepened with time. They ate breakfast on their back patio, surrounded by the garden they'd planted together, and talking about their plans for the day. Gary had a work project he wanted to finish, and Kenneth had papers to grade, but they were in no hurry to start their respective tasks. I've been thinking, Gary said as they lingered over their second cups of coffee, about that conversation we had years ago, about what it feels like to find the right person. Kenneth smiled, remembering that pivotal evening when Gary had first begun to question his feelings. What about it? You said it feels like coming home, like electricity, like finding someone who sees all of you and chooses to stay. And you were right, but it's more than that too. Kenneth leaned forward, interested in Gary's perspective after years of marriage. Quote 376. Gary continued thoughtfully. Quote 377. Kenneth felt his throat tighten with emotion. Quote 378. Gary reached across the table to take Kenneth's hand, his thumb tracing the wedding ring that Kenneth still sometimes touched unconsciously, still amazed that he got to wear it. I think about that scared, confused man I was when we first got together, Gary said, and I'm grateful for him because his courage to question everything led me to you. But I'm also grateful that I'm not him anymore. I'm grateful for who I've become with your love and support. Kenneth squeezed Gary's hand, thinking about his own transformation over the years. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both lost in their own reflections on the journey that had brought them to this peaceful Saturday morning. Quote 382. Kenneth asked. Gary considered the question seriously. Quote 383. Kenneth nodded, believing that too. Quote 384. Gary's smile was radiant. I'm so glad you didn't settle. I'm so glad we both had the courage to want more. Kenneth stood up, moving around the table to pull Gary into his arms. Dance with me. Gary laughed, looking around their empty patio. There's no music. We don't need music, Kenneth replied, beginning to sway gently with Gary in his arms. Gary melted into the embrace, following Kenneth's lead as they danced slowly in their backyard. Kenneth could hear birds singing in the trees they'd planted, could smell the flowers blooming in their garden, could feel the warmth of Gary's body against his and the steady beat of his heart. Quote 389. Gary said softly, echoing Kenneth's thoughts. You're perfect, Kenneth replied, meaning it completely. Gary pulled back to look at Kenneth, his eyes bright with love and contentment. We're perfect together. Kenneth kissed him then, pouring all of his love and gratitude into the contact. After all these years, Gary's kisses still made his heart race, still sent electricity shooting through his entire body. When they broke apart, both breathing slightly harder, Gary rested his forehead against Kenneth's. I love our life, Gary said simply. So do I, Kenneth replied. I love everything about it. I love this house and our families and our friends and our routines, but mostly I love you. Gary's smile was soft and wondering, as if he still couldn't quite believe how lucky they were. Sometimes I think about that night when I first told you I was confused about my feelings. I was so scared, so uncertain about everything. I never could have imagined that confusion would lead to this. Kenneth stroked Gary's cheek gently. 396. Gary leaned into Kenneth's touch, his eyes fluttering closed. I'm so grateful for every moment of it, even the difficult parts, because they led us here. Kenneth felt a profound sense of peace wash over him as he held his husband in their backyard, surrounded by the life they'd built together. Quote 398, he said softly. Quote 390. Gary agreed, opening his eyes to meet Kenneth's gaze. And we're going to keep making it every day for the rest of our lives. Kenneth kissed him again, softer this time, a promise and a celebration all at once. I can't wait to see what comes next. Whatever it is, Gary said, we'll face it together. As they stood there in their garden, holding each other close, Kenneth reflected on the incredible journey that had brought them to this moment. From that first day in the coffee shop, when Gary had looked so lost and confused, to this morning when he'd woken up humming while making pancakes, the transformation had been remarkable. Kenneth thought about all the people who had supported them along the way. Hannah, who had seen what was happening between them before they had even understood it themselves. Gary's parents, who had chosen love over fear when faced with something they didn't initially understand. Kenneth's own family, who had welcomed Gary with open arms. The friends who had celebrated their love and supported them through the challenges of building a life together. Quote 404. Gary said, his voice soft in the morning air. Quote to quote Farakum. Kenneth's heart swelled with love and gratitude. I know exactly what you mean. I spent so many years feeling like a ghost in my own life, watching you from the sidelines, loving you but never believing I could have you. But now I feel like I'm finally fully myself. Gary pulled back to look at Kenneth, his expression serious. Do you think we would have found each other in a different life if circumstances had been different? Kenneth considered the question, thinking about all the factors that had aligned to bring them together. I think so. I think some connections transcend circumstances. But I'm grateful for this life, for exactly the way things happened. Even the painful parts? Especially the painful parts, Kenneth said firmly, because they taught us how precious this is. They taught us not to take our love for granted. Gary's smile was brilliant. Quote 413, Kenneth felt heat creep up his neck at the compliment. Even after all these years, Gary's words still had the power to make him feel like the most special person in the world. What do you think people see when they look at us? Kenneth asked, curious about Gary's perspective. Gary was quiet for a moment, considering. Quote 4, Kenneth felt tears prick at his eyes. Quote 4, quote from Gary said with certainty. And quote 4, Kenneth laughed, wiping at his eyes. Quote Tron, and Gary's expression grew tender. Like what? Kenneth thought for a moment, wanting to give Gary a real answer. Like the way you sing in the shower when you think I can't hear you. Like how you always remember to buy my favorite coffee even when you're getting groceries without a list. Like how you get excited about small things. Like finding the perfect spot for a new plant in our garden. Gary's cheeks flushed slightly. Quote 422, quote 423, man, Kenneth said firmly. Quote 424, Gary kissed him then, soft and sweet and full of gratitude. When they broke apart, both of them were smiling. Quote 425, Gary said, though he made no move to leave Kenneth's arms. Probably, Kenneth agreed, also making no effort to end their embrace. But this is nice too. This is perfect, Gary corrected, just like everything else about our life together. Kenneth felt a profound sense of contentment wash over him. I used to dream about moments like this, but I never really believed they could be real. I never believed I could be this happy. Well, believe it, Gary said, spinning Kenneth around playfully. Because this is real, and it's ours, and it's just the beginning. Kenneth laughed as Gary spun him, feeling giddy with love and joy. Just the beginning. Just the beginning, Gary confirmed, pulling Kenneth close again. We have the rest of our lives to create more moments like this. Kenneth looked into Gary's eyes, seeing his own future reflected there, and felt overwhelmed by the beauty of it all. Quote 436, quote 437. Gary replied, and then he was kissing Kenneth again, and Kenneth was kissing him back. And the world around them faded away until there was nothing but this moment, this love, this perfect life they'd built together. As they finally made their way back into the house, Kenneth caught sight of their reflection in the kitchen window and smiled. They looked like what they were, two people who had found their home in each other, who had been brave enough to follow their hearts even when the path was uncertain, who had chosen love over fear and had been rewarded with something beautiful beyond their wildest dreams. Kenneth thought about that confused, scared man Gary had been when he first started questioning his feelings, and the patient, hopeful man Kenneth had been when he was loving Gary from a distance. Those men had been necessary, had played their parts in this love story, but Kenneth was grateful to be who he was now. Gary's husband, Gary's partner, Gary's home. As Gary began to clear their breakfast dishes, humming that same soft tune from earlier, Kenneth felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. This was his life. This was his love. This was his home. And it was more beautiful than anything he had ever dared to imagine. Later that afternoon, as they worked in their respective spaces, Gary at his computer in their home office and Kenneth grading papers at the kitchen table, Kenneth found himself thinking about the ripple effects of their love story. He thought about the other couples they knew who had been inspired by their relationship to be more honest about their own feelings, about the young people in their community who had seen them as examples of what was possible. Kenneth remembered a conversation he had had with one of his students, a young man named Carl who had been struggling with his own sexuality. Carl had approached Kenneth after class one day, nervous and uncertain, asking for advice about coming out to his family. "Professor Bailey," Carl had said, his voice shaking slightly, "I heard that you're married to a man. Is that true?" Kenneth had confirmed it, and Carl had visibly relaxed. "How did you know you were gay?" Carl had asked. "How did you find the courage to tell people?" Kenneth had thought about Gary, about their journey together, about the courage it had taken for both of them to be honest about their feelings. "Sometimes we don't know right away," Kenneth had told Carl. "Sometimes it takes time to understand ourselves. And courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what's right even when you're afraid. But I can tell you that living authentically, being true to who you are, is worth any temporary discomfort." Carl had nodded, tears in his eyes. "Did your family accept you?" "Eventually, yes," Kenneth had said. "And even when acceptance takes time, you're still worthy of love and respect exactly as you are." Kenneth had given Carl some resources and encouraged him to reach out if he needed support. A few months later, Carl had stopped by Kenneth's office to tell him that he'd come out to his family and that, while it had been difficult at first, they were working through it together. "Thank you," Carl had said. "Knowing that you and your husband exist, that you're happy together, it gave me hope that I could have that too someday." Kenneth had been deeply moved by Carl's words, by the realization that their love story had provided hope and inspiration for someone else navigating their own journey of self-discovery. Now, as Kenneth sat at his kitchen table grading papers, he could hear Gary typing in the next room, probably working on one of his engineering projects with the same focused intensity he brought to everything he cared about. Kenneth smiled, thinking about how much he loved the sound of Gary working, the quiet concentration that meant Gary was fully engaged with something challenging and interesting. Quote 409, Gary called from the office. Quote 45, Kenneth called back. Quote 45, quote 45, Gary replied. Quote 453. Kenneth felt a familiar surge of pride in Gary's intelligence and dedication. Even after all these years, he was still impressed by Gary's ability to solve complex problems, his persistence in the face of challenges. A few minutes later, Gary appeared in the kitchen, stretching his arms above his head and looking satisfied with his work. Kenneth suggested, looking up from the last paper in his stack. Quote 455. Gary said, moving to stand behind Kenneth's chair and massage his shoulders. "You look tense." Kenneth leaned into Gary's touch, feeling the knots in his shoulders begin to ease under Gary's skilled hands. "That feels amazing." Gary continued the massage, his hands working gently but firmly on Kenneth's neck and shoulders. Kenneth said, tilting his head back to look at Gary upside down. Quote for 6. Gary leaned down to kiss Kenneth's forehead. "Anytime. I love taking care of you." Kenneth felt his heart flutter at the simple declaration. I love taking care of you too. Gary moved around to sit in the chair next to Kenneth, reaching for his hand. What were you thinking about while you were grading? You had that contemplative look you get when you're processing something deep. Kenneth smiled, always amazed by how well Gary knew him. I was thinking about Carl, that student I told you about, who came to me for advice about coming out, and about how our story has touched other people's lives. Gary's expression grew thoughtful. Quote 475. Quote 46, Kenneth said firmly. Quote 467. Gary squeezed Kenneth's hand. I'm proud of what we've built together, not just our relationship, but the way we've been able to help other people along the way. Kenneth brought Gary's hand to his lips, pressing a soft kiss to his knuckles. Quote 469. Gary's eyes misted over slightly. I couldn't have done any of it without you. You've been my anchor through every challenge, my safe harbor in every storm. Kenneth felt tears prick at his own eyes. And you've been my home, my heart, my greatest adventure. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both lost in their own reflections on the journey they'd shared. Quote, Gary suggested eventually. Quote, ironed, quote, Kenneth agreed, standing and stretching his own stiff muscles. They made their way through their neighborhood, hand in hand, greeting neighbors and enjoying the late afternoon sunshine. Kenneth loved these walks with Gary, the easy conversation and comfortable silences, the way Gary would point out interesting architectural details or change in their neighbors' gardens. As they passed the house where the young couple Elizabeth and Carl had recently moved in, Kenneth saw Elizabeth working in her front yard and waved. She looked up and smiled, waving back enthusiastically. How are the newlyweds settling in? Gary called out. Wonderfully, Elizabeth replied, straightening up and brushing dirt from her hands. We're finally starting to feel like this is home. Kenneth and Gary approached the fence, and Kenneth could see the happiness radiating from Elizabeth's face. She and Carl had been married for just 3 months, and they still had that glow of new love that Kenneth remembered from his own early days with Gary. Quote 478, Kenneth observed, noting the careful arrangement of flowers and vegetables that Elizabeth had been tending. Quote, Brown, Elizabeth said proudly. Quote, Fredishon, Gary laughed. Quote, Vroan, Elizabeth grinned. Quote, Freddie. As they continued their walk, Kenneth reflected on how much joy he found in these simple interactions with their neighbors, the sense of community and belonging that he and Gary had built in their neighborhood. Quote 483. Kenneth said suddenly, the words spilling out before he could stop them. Gary squeezed his hand. What about for eat farm? Kenneth looked around at their neighborhood, at the trees they'd watched grow taller over the years, at the houses where they'd celebrated births and mourned loss and shared countless ordinary moments with the people who had become their extended family. Quote 4-7, Kenneth said. Quote Vice John. Gary nodded, understanding exactly what Kenneth meant. Quote 487. Quote Fudden, Kenneth said. Quote 489. Gary stopped walking, turning to face Kenneth fully. Quote 490. Kenneth felt his breath catch at the simple truth of Gary's words. I love you so much. I love you too, Gary replied. And then he was kissing Kenneth right there on the sidewalk, not caring who might see, just expressing the love that filled his heart to overflowing. When they broke apart, both of them were smiling. Come on, Gary said, tugging Kenneth's hand. Quote 494. Kenneth followed willingly, his heart full of love and gratitude for this life they'd built together, for the man who had been brave enough to question everything he thought he knew about himself, for the love that had transformed them both into the best versions of themselves. As they reached their front door, Kenneth paused to look back at their neighborhood, at the community they'd become part of, at the life they'd created together. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, and Kenneth felt a profound sense of contentment wash over him. What are you thinking about? Gary asked, following Kenneth's gaze. 96, Kenneth said softly, TO37. Gary wrapped his arms around Kenneth from behind, holding him close as they stood on their front porch. Hope 498. Kenneth leaned back into Gary's embrace, feeling the solid warmth of his husband's body against his back, breathing in the familiar scent that meant home and safety and love. Quote Washington, Kenneth asked. Gary was quiet for a moment, thinking. I quote Fawsham, Kenneth said, his voice soft with the memory. Quote Fo. Gary's arms tightened around Kenneth. I remember. I was so scared to say it, but I couldn't keep it inside anymore. Kenneth turned in Gary's arms, looking into his husband's eyes. I'm so glad you were brave enough to say it. I'm so glad you trusted me with your confusion and your fear. Gary cupped Kenneth's face in his hands, his thumbs brushing gently across Kenneth's cheekbones. You made it safe for me to be confused, to not have all the answers. You never made me feel like I had to figure everything out immediately. Kenneth felt tears prick at his eyes. I love you exactly as you are, in every moment, whether you have answers or not. I know, Gary said, and the simple certainty in his voice made Kenneth's heart soar. Go to 508. Kenneth kissed him then, pouring all of his love and gratitude into the contact. When they broke apart, both of them were smiling through their tears. Quote 509, Gary asked, though he seemed reluctant to end this perfect moment. Quote 519, Kenneth said. Quote 511, Gary nodded, understanding the impulse to hold on to this feeling, this perfect sense of rightness and completeness. Quote 512, Kenneth said suddenly. Gary's expression grew attentive. What is it? Kenneth took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. Sometimes I think about that man I used to be, the one who loved you from a distance and thought that was enough. And I feel sorry for him because he couldn't imagine that this was possible. He couldn't believe that love like this actually existed. Gary's eyes filled with tears. Quote 5 from, quote 516, Kenneth continued. Quote Fenton. Gary was crying openly now, his hands still framing Kenneth's face. I'm grateful to that scared, confused man I used to be too, because his willingness to question everything, to be vulnerable with you, led us here. Kenneth smiled through his own tears. We've come so far. We have, Gary agreed, and we still have so far to go. Kenneth felt a thrill of excitement at the thought of all the years they still had ahead of them, all the adventures and challenges and quiet moments they would share. I can't wait to see what comes next, Kenneth said. Whatever it is, Gary replied, we'll face it together. Kenneth kissed him again, soft and sweet and full of promise. When they finally went inside, Kenneth felt like he was carrying the golden light of the sunset with him, warming him from the inside out. As they settled into their evening routine, making dinner together and talking about their plans for the weekend, Kenneth marveled at how perfectly ordinary and extraordinarily beautiful their life had become. This was what love looked like in real life, not just the grand gestures and dramatic moments, but the quiet contentment of sharing a meal with somebody who knew you completely and loved you anyway. I love our ordinary moments, Kenneth said as they cleaned up the kitchen together, moving around each other with the easy choreography of years of shared domesticity. Gary smiled, understanding immediately what Kenneth meant. They're not ordinary at all, really. They're miraculous. Kenneth nodded, thinking about all the people in the world who were still searching for this kind of connection, this sense of home and belonging. We're very lucky, Kenneth said. We are, Gary agreed. But we also worked for this. We were brave when we needed to be brave, honest when we needed to be honest, patient when we needed to be patient. Kenneth felt a surge of pride in what they'd accomplished together. Quote 530, quote 53, Gary corrected, pulling Kenneth into his arms. Quote 532, Kenneth laughed, feeling giddy with love and possibility. Quote 533, as they headed upstairs to bed, Kenneth reflected on the incredible journey that had brought them to this moment. From confusion to clarity, from friendship to marriage, from two separate lives to one shared existence filled with love and purpose and joy. Gary had been right all those years ago when he'd said he didn't understand his feelings. But then he looked at Kenneth like he suddenly did, and everything had changed. Everything had become possible. Now, as Kenneth watched Gary getting ready for bed, humming that same soft tune he'd been humming all day, Kenneth felt overwhelmed with gratitude for the courage they'd both found to follow their hearts, even when the path was uncertain. This was their love story. It had begun with confusion and fear, but it had bloomed into something beautiful and lasting and true. And every day they continued to choose each other, continued to build something extraordinary out of the ordinary moments that made up a life shared. Kenneth smiled as Gary reached for his hand, leading him toward their bed, toward another night of dreams shared and morning plans made together. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new joys, but they would face them together, just as they had faced everything else. This was love. This was home. This was the life they had built together, one brave choice at a time. And it was absolutely perfect.